In this video, I'm going to go through the logic of the first economic model that we have seen in class, and that's the model of comparative advantage, specialization, and trade. So here we have a simple diagram where we're imagining that there are two people, Carlos and Greta, who are farmers. And the y-axis of the diagram shows apples in bushels. The horizontal axis shows wheat and in tons. And so points inside this diagram show different combinations of wheat and apples. And in particular, there are two lines, a green line for Carlos and an orange line for Greta. And points on those lines show different combinations of apples and wheat that each of Carlos and Greta can produce on their farms. So Carlos can produce any combination of apples and wheat on the green line. Greta can produce any combination of apples and wheat on the orange line. And so there are a couple of things to notice about that. The first thing you'll notice is that Greta is more productive in absolute terms than Carlos. She always produces more of either apples or wheat in absolute terms than he does. The second thing to note, and the thing that's most important, is that the slopes of these two lines are different. So Carlos's line is more steeply sloped than Greta's. So what does this mean? This means that Carlos and Greta face different trade-offs between the amount of apples and the amount of wheat that they can each produce. And so, for example, Carlos, his line has a slope whereby if he increases the amount of wheat that he produces by 1 ton, that means he's going to have to produce 50 bushels less of apples. You know, what is the logic behind that? Well, he's going to have to use his resources in a different way to get more wheat out of his land. And when you use more of your resources for doing one of the two things you do, then you're going to do the other thing less well. Greta's trade-off is more shallow. So if she wants to produce an additional ton of wheat, she only has to give up 25 bushels of apples to do that. So the important thing to recognize here is that Greta and Carlos face different trade-offs in choosing how much wheat or apples to produce. Greta in particular has a shallower trade-off between apples and wheat than Carlos does. So since Carlos is getting more apples for each ton of wheat that he forgoes than Greta does, so if he gives up a ton of wheat or produces a ton less, he's going to get 50 more apples. If Greta produces a ton less of wheat, she's going to only get 25 bushels more. That means Carlos has a comparative advantage in producing apples, even though Greta may have an absolute advantage in producing both of them with her farm. And so as it turns out, it's comparative advantage that determines what someone should specialize in. So even though Carlos is not very good at producing either apples or wheat on his farm, since he's relatively better at producing apples than wheat than Greta is, that says that he should specialize on his farm in producing only apples, and Greta should produce only wheat, and they should trade with one another, and that will make both of them better off. So when people can trade with one another, they should specialize in the activity in which they have a comparative advantage. How does that work? Let's look at a sort of more detailed and specific. So let's suppose that initially Greta and Carlos have chosen to produce at the blue dots here. So this blue dot for Greta represents about 23 tons of wheat and 625 bushels of apples. Carlos's blue dot represents 18 tons of wheat and 100 bushels of apples. And so we're going to do a thought experiment. Suppose that moving from these initial blue dots, they changed their decision about how much wheat and apples to produce, each of them according to their own line. So imagine that Greta went from producing 23 tons of apples to 24, and that would lead her to produce 25 bushels less of apples, so she'd produce 600. And then we suppose that Carlos decreases his wheat production from 18 to 17, and doing that allows him to produce 50 more bushels of apples. So this is what happens to Greta. That's what happens to Carlos. What's happened to the total production across both of their farms of wheat and apples? Well, they produce the same amount of wheat because Greta decided to produce 1 ton more, Carlos 1 ton less. Greta produces 25 fewer bushels of apples, and Carlos produces 50 bushels more. And so what that means is that the total production of grain across both of their farms is the same. But apple production has gone up by 25 bushels. So between the two of them, there's now more to go around. Now suppose that what Greta does is says, hey Carlos, I'll give you a ton of wheat in exchange for 30 bushels of apples. And that will leave them after this trade with Carlos having 18 tons of wheat and 120 bushels of apples. Greta will have 23 tons of wheat and 655 bushels of apples. So they'll both have the same amount of wheat as before, but will have more in the way of apples. Would Carlos accept that bargain? Well, Carlos knows that if he were to, when he produces a ton less of wheat, he gets 50 more bushels of apples. So if Greta makes this offer to him, he knows that he'll still have the same amount of wheat afterwards. If he produces a ton less and gets a ton from Greta, he'll be sort of the same as before on wheat. But he'll have 20 more bushels of apples. He'll have produced 50 more and have given 30 to Greta in exchange for the wheat, and so he'll have a net increase of 20. And so these green stars show us how much Greta and Carlos are going to have to consume after they have decided to alter their production plans and then trade with one another. And you'll notice that both of these green stars are above the lines at which the respective farms can engage in production. So by being able to trade, Greta and Carlos are both able to consume a combination of wheat and apples that are better for them than what they could do just by producing on their own. And so here a specialization and the ability to trade with one another have made both Carlos and Greta better off. And so the simple logic, sort of extending that simple logic of that example even further, you can sort of increase the amount of wheat that Greta produces even more and have that get traded to Carlos, who's going to be producing even less wheat. And the same logic will lead to a complete specialization of these two farmers. So Carlos will specialize entirely in producing apples, Greta entirely in producing wheat, and then they'll trade with one another so that they can consume each a combination of apples and wheat. And so comparative advantage, when people are able to trade, determines a pattern of specialization in production. And that specialization happens even when one of the producers, like in our case Greta, is absolutely better in absolute terms at producing both of the goods. And so you can see that if you were to have just kind of tried to think this through kind of without having this sort of simple model written down to use to think with, you might have said, well, it would kind of make sense that people should specialize in the thing that they're absolutely better at everyone else in doing. And the reason that doesn't work is that you're not taking into account the possibility that people can trade with one another. And so being able to sort of work through the logic of this example reveals something about the nature of economic sort of economic activity that would have been hard for you to sort of see had you not kind of written down the logical structure and thought through it in a step-by-step way.